Good afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. We are live streaming today from the Boathouse at Confluence Park. Metro Club live streaming today is presented by Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. Thank you so much for your support. On to today's forum, Solving the Affordable Housing Puzzle. The forum today is sponsored by Homeport. Thank you. Central Ohio is quite popular, and the housing market reflects a boom in demand in the face of low supply. It's expensive to build new homes. There are labor shortages, material costs, land and zoning restrictions. Those are one part of the equation. Discrimination in lending and rental practices are another. With ever more people needing a roof over their heads, how do we solve the interwoven challenges of affordability, location, and equity? Well, we'll find out. Please welcome our guests today. First, we have General Counsel and Director of CDFI Investments at the Affordable Housing Trust for Columbus and Franklin County, Lark Mallory. Director of Data and Mapping at MORPC, Schill. President of Fairfield Homes, Inc., Jennifer Gorsuch Walters. And our host for today, journalist with the Columbus Dispatch, will be Mark Ferenchik. Mark, the stage is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody for tuning in and listening in. Excuse me. Obviously, we are in an affordable housing crunch here in Central Ohio and in other parts of the country as well. We're expecting another 1 million residents in Central Ohio through 2050. That's going to bring the population to roughly 3 million. Having said that, right now, there is probably a gap of about 48,000 affordable housing units in the area that we're trying to make up. In the meantime, people are rent burdened because cost of living is still going up, wages are not. Want to ask each of you what you see as the biggest burdens and the biggest challenges right now for building and maintaining affordable housing here in Central Ohio. And we'll start with Lark, and then Aaron and Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, CMC, for having me here today. As Mark mentioned, I am General Counsel for the Affordable Housing Trust. We are a lender to developers of affordable housing, so I won't answer that question with specifics on the shortages in construction supply or the issues with zoning. I'm going to answer that question in a much broader sense. What I see as one of the biggest hurdles in developing affordable housing here in Central Ohio is still the issue with NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. People don't want affordable housing where they live. We've all heard the dog whistles. We've all heard that it increases crime, it brings down property value, and that's prohibiting or making it more difficult to develop affordable housing. I also think there is an issue with the perception of it's not my issue. So, for example, I'm okay. I don't really care if Mary is not okay, and Mary needs affordable housing. But what we have to realize is that we are all in this together, and it's an issue across the board. So, for example, and I thought this was interesting, the Kentucky National Organization of Women described affordable housing as a feminist issue. If a woman is in an abusive relationship, if she can't afford rent, she can't get out. So these issues affect all of us across the board. We've got to accept that it's going to take all of us to address them. And right now, we're not reaching out to all of the constituencies, or they're not bringing themselves to the table in the discussion.
So first, I want to just say thank you for the opportunity to be here. MORPC's been working with a couple dozen funders and dozens of stakeholders over the last couple of years on a regional housing strategy. So we've been digging really deeply into some of these challenges. And I know we'll get into some of the complexities with policy and with financing, but at risk of oversimplifying, I think it's important to call out that we are in a historically tight housing market. The average home is on the market for about 6 days right now. The average rental vacancy is about 5%, but there's a lot of nuance and complexity in some of those numbers. So we see much lower vacancy rates in the 1 or 2% range for what would be considered affordable housing to middle and low income families. So all of us are seeing the tightness in the market, but it is compounded for folks who have barriers, whether that's income, whether that's racial barriers, whether that is disabilities or needs that we're not building for in enough numbers. So the supply and demand seems like a simple issue to try to solve, but there's really a lot of complexity and nuance to that.
Thank you. I'd like to add about the residents who are in existing affordable housing. So we have about almost close to 5,000 homes across the state of Ohio, and currently what we're seeing is about 250% increase with our resident delinquency. So that is families who are unable to pay full rent or and also not paying rent on time. So in addition to that, our property taxes and expenses are going up at the properties, so that reliability of cash flow has been shortened. And our residents are needing a lot more services today than they did before. So everyone's really struggling, and the other biggest need that I'm seeing and the challenges is the increase in need for resident subsidy. So the families and individuals who were living in affordable housing in the service industry and lost their jobs now need rental subsidy that they didn't need a year ago. And it's super hard to find, and it's not accessible for our residents.
So again, you were talking about NIMBYism, and recently this week, Reynoldsburg just passed what was called source of income legislation, where basically if you're a landlord, you cannot deny somebody a residence based on their source of income, whether it be federal subsidies or other sources if you're a veteran. Bexley's already passed this. Columbus has recently passed this, as well as Westerville. Talk a little bit about if this is needed in other suburbs, but also the difficulty in making this type of legislation happen, not only with public officials, but also in communities that may resist attempts to build more affordable housing in them.
That's a very good question, and I was just informed this morning that the Reynoldsburg legislation passed. Thank you, City Council Member Shanette Strickland, for pushing that forward. But this goes to the very issue of NIMBYism. If we didn't have the pre-existing I guess, discriminatory attitudes, then that type of legislation wouldn't be needed, but clearly it is. And we do have some suburbs that are making strides there. As you mentioned, Bexley started it, but we need to look at it from an overall community, an overall Central Ohio objective. Without that type of legislation, we end up putting a lot of the burden on the city of Columbus because the suburbs aren't taking those steps that need to be taken. I would like to see more of that. And I know, Aaron, you probably see it in some of the research you've done.
Absolutely, yeah. I mentioned a couple dozen funding partners in the regional housing strategy work that we're doing. Most of those are communities, and the local elected officials, the city staff are there for the most part. They're the ones saying, we know we need to build more housing for our residents. The name of this forum is affordable housing. What we talk about is housing that is affordable and appropriate for anyone living in a community. And so the term affordable housing has a lot of stigma to it, but what we're really talking about is people that make a living wage, teachers, city employees, the people that are your neighbors, being able to live in the community that they work in. And a lot of local elected officials are there, and they're asking, how do we do this? Where we're seeing a lot of pushback and where we need to help dispel some myths is with resident advisory boards, so planning commissions, board of zoning appeals, and then the average resident who is understandably concerned about what's this going to do to my community. I want to preserve the community that I enjoy. So there are some understandable concerns that we need to help address. So multifamily housing is not going to have negative impacts on a school district, for example. That may be a question that someone has, but that's something that we can help inform and clarify and help people see that what's going in is actually going to be an asset to their community.
But Aaron,
go ahead, Lark.
To your point, MORPC looked at this issue as a regional strategy and not just, say, the city of Columbus or Franklin County, but bringing all of the municipalities to the table so that we can address this and not one community be burdened with the issue of affordable housing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we see it even in smaller communities and where we build, is that, and we've had many experiences where the mayors and the city managers are on board and want affordable housing in their community, and it just gets stuck along the way. And once, and it can significantly delay the opening of affordable housing, and so potential residents are delayed a year into housing. And but what happens, the outcome is, if we can get in there and we can have the conversation and start to develop wonderful, multi-million-dollar housing into a community, the residents start to contribute to the community. They want to work. They want to drive or walk to work, and they're part of the community. And we've seen great impact in communities where we've been welcomed in affordable housing.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I wanted to jump on that a little bit more. Tell our audience if there are any differences really between developing affordable housing in rural areas, challenges, compared to urban areas, what you see in Southeast Ohio and in Lancaster and Fairfield County.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I would say the biggest challenge in rural areas is having the conversation and getting to the table about the need for affordable housing and just all the resources that are needed. We can't build, it's not sustainable to build a high-density 100-unit apartment complex in Perry County when they just need 25 or 35 apartments. So to scale that and have that conversation about the appropriate resources, just getting to the table is the challenge. In more suburban areas, it's a easier conversation to have at the table, but we get stuck at the Board of Zoning Appeals and with the neighbors and with NIMBY as well.
Yeah. As we're talking about affordable housing, it's also an economic issue. I know that there have been concerns that if Columbus and surrounding areas don't build enough affordable housing, it's going to be hard to create and keep certain jobs here because people won't be able to afford to live here based on the cost of housing. Can you talk about that a little bit too, about affordable housing as an economic development issue?
Yeah, if I can. One of the challenges is building the diversity of housing that we need. So subsidized housing, which is actually providing some sort of subsidy, is a piece, but is always going to be a portion of meeting the affordable housing need that exists. So we see the number about 50,000 or so of a shortage in subsidized housing. Data that we looked at, there are about 80,000 households under the poverty threshold, more than there are units of subsidized housing in Central Ohio. And that's just people in poverty. So there are people above the poverty line that are still struggling and need some sort of help. So that 50,000 estimate is probably low in terms of people that are really struggling to maintain appropriate housing for their income levels. But what we see in what's being built is not the diversity that we need in price points, and I know we're going to get into costs and some of the challenges with that, but the average apartment being built right now goes for $1,350 a month. If you make $50,000 a year, you can afford about $1,000 a month before you are really, really overstretching your budget. And so right now we're not building enough of the products, whether there's subsidy or not, we're just not building enough of the diversity in products to meet the needs that exist in the community.
And I would add to that. Last week, the panel brought up benefits glide, which I like really, really well. So I would complement that by saying that we need scaffolding and housing. There are, like Aaron said, there are a ton of, there are people who need the subsidy, and more people need a portion of their rent subsidized to just move them ahead. Everyone wants to better themselves. And so that step up helps them. That little bit of subsidy helps them. And so a real life story is in Lancaster, we built a Pearl House, which is a housing for homeless families who are in recovery. There is a single father of 3 children who lived in his car for over a year, finally was able to move into Pearl House. It's 100% subsidized, so they end up paying a portion of their rent. He lived there for a couple of years and was able to have a voucher into more independent housing. And he was really nervous about leaving Pearl House because of all the services that we provided and the security in that housing, but he knew there was a long list of people that really needed that 100% subsidy and those services. And so he had the courage to, and he had the accessibility to have a voucher to move to more independent housing. So from that housing, he wants to get, he gets a promotion and gets a better job. Where does he go from there? So I go back to what Aaron was saying. The need for all types of housing is very desperate, and that scaffolding is important and makes a huge difference.
Mark, I also want to add to your question about economic development and how this affects all of us. Yeah. We see a perfect example of the lack of affordable housing in Reynoldsburg. Reynoldsburg just attracted an organization, shorthand the Alliance. That organization is bringing 200 employees, $10 million in annual payroll to Reynoldsburg from Colorado Springs. President and CEO specifically cited a lack of affordable housing. So that is a direct economic impact to our community. We've now gained 200 additional employees, $10 million in payroll, and a loss to Colorado Springs because of a lack of affordable housing. Affordable housing, whether we have it or not, is going to affect all of us and not just the individual tenants who need it. And Aaron, I think it's interesting. I don't know if you saw AHACO's recent, they do those infographics, but they said that we lost, here I have 19,000 apartments for folks under $900 a month. We lost 19,000 apartments in a 2-year period from 2017 to 2019. And that goes to your point that if you're making around $50,000, anything over $1,000 per month is going to burden your family. So we're not just talking about folks who are receiving vouchers, but folks across the income spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we lose sight of that.
And we know that the most stable housing is housing you're already in, and the most affordable housing is housing that already exists. So to the extent we can be looking at ways to keep people in their housing, and to the extent that we can look at either refurbishing or making housing that already exists affordable and available to people are some strategies that I think there's real opportunity there. There's some exciting programs. We just hosted a peer-to-peer forum with as a part of the Regional Housing Strategy series that highlighted a program called Nesterly, which is bringing a new kind of tenant-landlord option to elderly residents where they can actually open up their home to a tenant who is living with them, can provide some services in exchange for reduced rent. It's an income opportunity for those older adults. I think creative solutions like that that allow people to stay in their homes that they're already in, and allow us to keep what we think of as naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH, in the market and available to people rather than trying to build our way out is a real important strategy that sometimes gets overlooked when we talk about how do we build more and build more, which is really important, but we need to be looking at both of those options.
I want to revisit the NIMBY discussion again to some extent beyond saying that it's a good economic development tool. How, beyond just convincing specific communities and their leaders or elected officials or city staffs that this would be a good idea, how do you convince people who already live in these types of communities that this is good for them. It's good for the community as a whole. What types of discussions should you be able to have with people in some suburbs or exurban areas that may be dragging their feet on this to some extent?
I think, I'll just jump in here. I think you get, in my experience, you get them exposed. So ask people to travel. I know it's a little bit difficult now, but we are opening up safely. Safely, people can visit existing affordable housing communities and tour them, meet with the residents, see how beautiful it is and the impact it's making in the community. We saw that firsthand. We built a community in Lancaster. Zanesville called us, wanted something similar, and it was much easier in Zanesville because they saw it, they touched it, they toured it, and we were able to go into Zanesville much smoother than we were in Lancaster for the first time. So just exposure as much as we can to city officials, politicians, to existing affordable housing is huge.
I think that's so important. It is helping people understand that density, more compact development is an amenity for your community. We see it in surveys by the National Board of Realtors. We see that this is a preference that people have regardless of what their income is, regardless of what they can afford, that people want communities that are walkable, where restaurants and jobs and opportunities are nearby. And that's really what we're talking about. It's building those kinds of developments, but doing it in a way that allows a range of folks to live there. And it's helping them understand that it's not a bunch of new people moving to your community that have never been there before. It's your neighbors that have different jobs, have different circumstances, and just need different options for housing.
And also explaining to them how affordable housing affects us overall. I gave the example of the Kentucky Women's Organization, but we can also talk about Dr. Amy Acton's words about where you live, how your zip code affects your overall health outcomes. And it affects education, it affects health, your safety. We've got to start having those conversations and dispelling some of the very myths, Aaron, that you mentioned initially. Information, truth. Yeah.
Right. So the city of Columbus is requiring developers now who are building apartments that 20% of the units are supposed to be set aside for affordable housing. But there's a clause in there basically where they can buy their way out of that. The Affordable Housing Trust would like to see that eliminated. Can you explain a little bit about your reasoning behind that?
Sure. After George Floyd, and the social unrest that the country experienced, our board chair, Bob Weiler, took one of our normal board meetings and talked about how we could have a better impact, a much broader impact, still in our lane, but a broader impact on the community overall. And one of the issues that came up, one of the suggestions that came up was doing away with the 20%. As Aaron just said, we can't build our way out of this. And if you're taking 20% of the units away, then are we really increasing that, or are we increasing the need to build more? You just can't build your way out, and the 20% puts an additional burden on us to build more.
And that buying your way out means that affordable housing that does get built ends up getting concentrated somewhere else. And it is not a coincidence, it's not an accident that those concentrations have been in certain neighborhoods, almost exclusively communities of color, for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And while specific policies may not be in place to segregate neighborhoods, we still see a lot of the legacy of those. So, one thing that we looked at is home loan denial rates. So when folks apply for a home loan, the denial rates are surprisingly close for the lowest income folks. Denial rates are pretty high, but they stay persistently high regardless of income level for communities of color. And what you would expect in white applicants, as your income goes up, the denial rates go down. You would think someone making over $200,000 a year is probably going to be approved for a loan, and we see that in white applicants. In black applicants, it doesn't really matter if you make $50,000 a year, $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 a year. We see persistently high denial rates, and so that's a legacy of it's not just folks approving the loans that are saying this is African-American applicant, I'm going to deny them. What it is a legacy of where segregation has happened and where people are applying for loans and the likelihood of loans in certain areas being approved. And so we see remnants of policies that may not be there still affecting affordability and creating segmented or segregated neighborhoods.
I'd like to get more into, I don't know.
No,
I'd like to get more into the concentrations of poverty issue. But I think I read an article on Housing Wire with respect to the denial rates, and a lot of that was even tied to student loan debt. When, Black students tend to take out more student loan debt, which then trickles over to a lower income to debt ratio, which then trickles over to higher denial rates. So this is a systemic building upon of issues that we've got to address overall. But yeah, we're looking at also where projects are being situated. We don't want to see concentrations of poverty in certain areas, and that's something that we're focused on as well.
So again, we're talking about concentrations of poverty and legacy and neighborhoods that were redlined 70, 80 years ago. That still plays a role in this as well, correct?
Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So right now, the city of Columbus, to that end, they are embarking on doing a new zoning code. And there have been discussions about tailoring it, or at least some neighborhood leaders have said it can't be a one-size-fits-all code. Maybe it has to be tailored to specific neighborhoods. Right now, there are a lot of neighborhoods, specifically in the central city, where they are seeing larger apartment projects being proposed. And people, again, don't think it fits with the neighborhood, and also they're fearful of apartments in general. What can the city do in terms of just zoning so affordable housing can be built throughout the city and not just concentrate in certain areas?
So this might be a little tangential to what you, to the question, but first of all, the city has a once in a generation or once in a few generations opportunity. It's been decades since the City of Columbus zoning code was comprehensively updated. And talking with some folks in the development department at the city, the percentage of rezoning applications that require some sort of variance right now is in the high 90s. Almost 100% of rezoning applications require some sort of variance. So one of the biggest things that the new zoning code can do is be straightforward, be easier to navigate, and be a little clearer. What that does is, for developers, it makes it more predictable. It makes it easier to approach a project and know what your answer is going to be and how you're going to move through the project. So that reduces some risk for developers. One of the other key things it does is it makes projects easier for new developers, for a new diversity of products to come into the market. So if you're a small developer, navigating zoning codes, navigating variances, navigating planning commissions is a challenging and often kind of intimidating process. So to the extent we can make it more straightforward, and that's true both on the policy side and the finance side, to the extent we can open up these processes so that people are more easily navigating them, it's going to increase that diversity in the market and make it easier for small new developers to be able to get in. And they're often the ones that are bringing those small projects in neighborhoods that are going to increase diversity in the neighborhoods that need it the most.
And that's a great point, because I was going to comment that the more common sense or some bold action around zoning codes, the better, so all developers can come to the table. And even smaller developers sometimes have more creative solutions and will build really appropriate housing if they can get through the zoning. And so having those conversations around zoning and the variances and attorneys, it gets really expensive, and these small developments can't afford that. Also, when we're building permanent supportive housing where it's 100% subsidized and it's for people and families who are homeless, we don't need 100 parking spots. Families do not have cars. So just to apply some real life common sense boldness around the zoning would make a huge difference.
So we tend not to get into zoning issues very much because by the time the deal gets to us, zoning has already been addressed. But I do like your comments about addressing zoning so that we can have better access for smaller developers. Some of those smaller developers tend to be black and brown developers, and there are already burdens to entering the industry. If we can address zoning to reduce some of those burdens, I am totally for that.
And I want to call out financing as another key piece. So we have something like 50, 55 or so different financing mechanisms available to support development in Central Ohio. That is a huge number. That's great. You know, a lot of diversity of financing. We need more capital available, absolutely. But that, again, is a very intimidating, if you're looking at stacking, creating a capital stack with multiple different financing mechanisms, if you're starting out trying to redevelop a duplex or a triplex, that's an incredibly intimidating process to take on and can be incredibly expensive. So now you're looking at complex zoning variances, you're looking at a really complicated financing structure, and it just prices out a lot of potential developers from the market and being able to deliver innovative, kind of interesting and new projects.
So we are a CDFI, a Community Development Financial Institution. I represent us in the Ohio Association of CDFIs. We literally just had this conversation on Monday on our Ohio statewide call, but we've got to be able to increase funding to some of the smaller developers who tend to be black and brown developers who don't have generational wealth, and addressing zoning, but addressing the issue of providing funding in general is needed to allow others access to the market. We often talk about the demand for affordable housing, but we rarely talk about the supply. We rarely talk about who it is that is supplying the affordable housing. And when you have some of these smaller developers who are doing a duplex, or maybe they're doing 4 units, I think we need to start reaching out to them so that, one, and telling them about the potential funding sources out there. So on this call of CDFIs, we are being much more intentional. We agreed to be much more intentional about reaching out to the smaller businesses, the black or brown businesses that have not had access to traditional financing. I was also on a call with Chase last week, and as we all know, they made a $30 billion commitment in this area, not just affordable housing, but in equity in general. And they are targeting some of those smaller developers, some of those developers that have not had access to traditional capital. And we've got to be intentional there. We've got to start talking about demand, but also supply, and allowing others access to the market so they can be a part of that supply with creative solutions. We've got to be more equitable in this process.
We're going to be moving to questions from our live stream audience in a few minutes here. So if you want to leave our audience with any final thoughts about affordable housing, and also, are there any incentives that communities should be offering developers and others to make sure that there's an adequate supply of affordable housing now and in the future?
I would just say that what I'd like everyone to take away from this conversation is that affordable housing works. It's proven. People are making their lives better. We are making our lives better when we live in a home. And that scaffolding of different levels of affordable housing is desperately needed at all levels, is what I'd like to leave the audience with.
So I would say that we need, on the public sector side, we need to challenge ourselves to create more predictable, as streamlined as possible processes so that the development community knows what they're getting, they can predict it, and they feel more comfortable moving forward. On the private sector side, on the financing side, we need more creative options. We need to look at other communities. We need to be open to potentially taking on more risk in what we develop and what those products look like, and just, again, creating more diversity in the market.
Absolutely agree with both Aaron and Jennifer. And for me, I think taken away is we need to be more intentional. We've got to be more intentional about addressing affordable housing across all constituencies and bringing all constituencies to the table for creative solutions. Intentionality.
So again, it's the Metropolitan Club's tradition to ask audience questions, and Jane Scott is here to give us some questions from the audience.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to condense some of them and consolidate some of them because they're similar ones. One would be, is there a leadership effort, like with MORPC or some of your organizations, that would potentially create RFPs for developers to say, look, we're looking for housing in certain areas, and then to help them navigate both the financing and the dollars so that this is done intentionally, as you mentioned?
I'm happy to speak for our work. In addition to the regional housing strategy, and as a part of that, we have set a number of high-level metrics, really 4 metrics that we're asking communities to focus on, moving the ball on. That includes increasing the supply, that includes addressing racial equity issues. But beyond the regional scale, we are beginning to roll out our work with individual communities to customize this and localize this to their needs. So over the coming several months and over the coming years, you'll see us working more directly with individual communities to take kind of this large regional scale analysis and a whole menu of options and figuring out what applies best. So in some cases, that might be something like an RFP open to various developers. It really is going to depend and be customized to individual communities.
Great. Catherine Logston of Results asked, do you really believe that mixed income neighborhoods are possible?
Yes.
Okay. And then her follow-up is, do you believe that Columbus and the region will ever support higher density to lower cost and preserve green space?
Absolutely, and I'll add on, I live in a mixed income neighborhood. I sought it out specifically for that reason, and it's not whether they're possible, it's whether we can preserve the ones that exist and encourage more. There's a lot of opportunity with zoning code changes to encourage density that doesn't feel like a lot more density, in addition to what we might think of as apartment complexes. So there's absolutely opportunity for that.
Great. Sarah Lenke, what can be done to retain affordable units when landlords raise rents because they know they can get it and they push working families out?
So, as I mentioned, we are a lender to developers of affordable housing. One of the things that we are doing is we are requiring land use restriction agreements. In order to borrow our funds, we now require you to restrict the units for a set period of time.
And I'll talk as a landlord. We want people to stay in their homes. So we are working on, like I mentioned before, we've seen an increase in delinquency of 250%, but that means we're just working harder on rent payment agreements. We want people to stay in their homes. It's better for them, it's better for us. I don't, we don't wake up in the morning wanting to evict.
Alicia Wiggins, is it time to build more multi-structures and not focus on single-family homes? What about repurposing buildings to use as transitional housing for homeless?
Well, we saw that. One, we are building more multi-family housing and not just single-family homes. And in terms of repositioning, we saw the perfect example of that with Carol Stewart project, where we redevelop, and we're one of the lenders over there as well. We've committed over there as well, where we've taken a hotel and repurposed that for children who are transitioning out of the foster care system. I'm the mother of 2 young adults. You can't say you're 18, you got to go. They still need support. And so we've seen that example led by the Finance Fund with some of our other public partners to do exactly that thing and reposition existing homes or existing hotels, especially for those aging out of foster care.
And we built Carol Stewart and managed Carol Stewart. It is fabulous. And Star House does a wonderful job. And Star House and Finance Fund are the developers and owners of that. And you're right. I mean, these are young adults who didn't have another place to go, and now they have their own home, and Star House is providing all the services, and they are starting to build their own life.
And what you said, Jennifer, young adults who didn't have any other place to go and didn't have a safety net.
No.
So when we start talking about our own children, we know how often we get calls from college, I need an additional XYZ amount, or I need another pair of basketball shoes. We're talking about children who don't have children, 18-year-olds, who don't have that safety net. That is a perfect example that I believe we can expand to other neighborhoods.
Yes, and you're right. It was a great repurpose of a vacant old motel that has turned into single apartments for 18 to 21-year-olds.
Awesome. So this is a related question, I guess. Anne Lamoureux, she's retired. She talked about multiple unit housing, but she's also asking about adding small separate rental spaces. For instance, like we used to repurpose backyard carriage spaces or garages, tiny house styles for in-laws or adult children or other. Does zoning allow that, and is zoning looking at changing that?
Yeah, and I'll reiterate that we've been building more multifamily housing than single-family housing for about the past 10 years. It was right after the recession that it flipped, and we, as a region, started building more multifamily. So that's been happening. The key is building a diversity of multifamily, so not building just one product. On the question of, so those are called accessible dwelling units or ADUs. Columbus is piloting that in a few neighborhoods, and I think is looking very hard at bringing that into the new zoning code updates on a more comprehensive scale. So exactly those kind of examples are what we're looking for.
So this is looking at more the living wage question, but Richard Needles, Productive People Strategies, what impact would a 15-hour minimum wage pegged to cost of living have on housing affordability? In other words, if we raise the wage to $15 minimum hourly wage, and it says pegged to cost of living, have on housing affordability?
I can speak that they'll have cash to be able to pay their rent.
This is an economic issue. I mean, what's affordable for me is not necessarily what's affordable for the young woman who provided my coffee this morning. This is an economic issue. I can't speak to whether $15 an hour, and I'm assuming by pegged, he means indexed for inflation year to year. That's what I think he means.
I assume so.
I can't say and maybe MORPC's done the research, but I can say that one of the things that we are doing is we are tying our products to those who are committed to paying a housing wage. Housing wage varies based on the number of people in your house, and solely to the sole point that this is an economic issue. No one wants to be housing burdened.
And I think that question illustrates how insufficient the current minimum wage is. So at $15 an hour, you're making about $30,000 a year, which means you can probably afford about $800 a month in rent before you're significantly cost burdened. There is very little available in the market at $800 or less. And we know the vacancy rate for that is below 1%. So even of the product that's there, almost none of it is ever available for someone. So if you're making $15 an hour, that's great, that's an improvement, but you probably are still in need of some sort of support, or you're overstretching your budget. So it helps, but it still doesn't even get us there to what is really widely available for someone at that pay rate.
And we're losing those housing units. Yeah. I cited AHACO's, stats earlier. We lost, 19,000 of those apartments in 2 years. So we're not making up ground there.
So A.B. Clayman from Move to Prosper says, research shows the benefit of mixed income housing. What is needed to make it a reality, not just in new development, but in existing neighborhoods?
I think it becomes a reality in smaller suburban areas and rural areas because that's what neighborhoods have. Our neighborhoods are filled with mixed income. So we see it working as we are building smaller communities in already existing neighborhoods.
It's one of the big challenges to preserving mixed income neighborhoods that we're seeing is challenges just getting a hold of land or housing to rehab and make available. So real estate investment trusts are a big challenge with this. So we see lots of speculative investors buying up property and holding on to it with the hope of being able to sell down the road. They actually aren't really selling a lot of them, so we see lots of vacant lots, lots of vacant houses that could be rehabbed and could be turned into mixed income housing, could be turned into duplexes or other affordable housing that is just sitting unavailable. So that's a real challenge that we need to look into how to address.
And I want to make sure that as we're having this conversation about mixed income neighborhoods, those existing neighborhoods where we have lower income populations, that we're not forcing them out. That we've got to come up with mechanisms that as a neighborhood gentrifies or we bring in some higher income neighbors, we aren't using code violations to force those existing neighbors out.
And prioritizing the need to preserve existing affordable housing is huge.
So, Carly Bose, what is your moonshot idea to fix housing? What is the ambitious idea we should put on this table?
Wow. Thanks, Carly.
Right.
Thought that was a good one to end with.
Well, you know, what I like, and I guess we can all answer in our own way, what I like is some of what OHACO is doing. OHACO is bringing everyone to the table. I know they have a grant being considered right now by Chase, and it's looking really good, but part of the attractiveness is that they brought everyone to the table. So what can we do? Let's keep bringing all of our constituencies to the table for the discussion.
Do you want to tell us what OHACO is?
Oh, Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, and Carly is the executive director, president, CEO. I'm not exactly sure of her exact title.
Okay.
But she's in charge over there.
All right.
And I would say we started today, and everyone having the courage to have conversations, the courage to have bold conversations around zoning and what's needed in different communities for success. And it really requires everyone at the table. And there's a lot of really creative housing that can happen. And as we start to see where people are now after COVID and what their needs are, how do we make more services within the apartments that make sense? Maybe not all the apartments need a workout facility, but do they need, in one of our apartments, we have Head Start in our apartment complex because that Head Start program complements all the children and the families there. So where do we start to challenge each other as developers and with the agencies that we work with of what makes sense where we are? What have we learned out of COVID, and how do we go forward in more creative, make sense housing?
And so as a planner, I would love to see a competition between communities for who can pilot and demonstrate the most unique, innovative solutions. The way that might work is someone mentioned an RFP or design challenge for bringing in and testing new models. So there are pocket neighborhoods where you can take a couple of lots and have shared green space, but build 4 or 5 houses where there maybe was just 1 or 2 before at a lower cost. There are religious organizations that are interested in developing land that they own and doing that in concert with communities to lower cost and have a mission focus on affordable housing. So seeing more interest in innovative models, case studies from other communities, and expediting those developments here would be great to see.
You all sounded like you sat together and practiced this before you showed up today. I hope everyone else found today's forum as interesting and informative as I did. You did a terrific job. Thank you. Our forum next week will explore the challenges facing kids and families during COVID and concerns about large numbers of them missing from school systems community-wide. Please join me in thanking today's sponsor, Homeport. And also thanks to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with Columbus Dispatch and PNC. Thanks again to our online virtual seat patrons, and most of all, thank you to those of you who were speakers today and joined us today for this fabulous presentation. Lark Mallory, Aaron Schill, Jennifer Gorsuch Walters, and Mark Ferenchik. We hope you will all tune in again next week. Until then, be well and stay safe. Thanks.